They laughed in her face before she said a single word, called her confused, asked if she was lost, told her the waiting area for assistance programs was across the street. A black woman in a gray suit had walked into the marble lobby of Mariton First Capital, and in less than 30 seconds, they stripped her of dignity with their eyes, their smirks, their practiced dismissals. She wasn't poor. She wasn't asking. She wasn't begging. But to them, she didn't belong. Not here. Not in a place built for power. They judged her before they saw her. They humiliated her before they knew her. What they didn't realize, what makes this story worth telling, is that the person they mocked didn't just come to the bank. She owned the future they were about to lose. And when the truth hit, it wouldn't come with shouting. It would come like a wrecking ball through glass silence. Watch until the end. This isn't a lesson. It's a reckoning. Like this video, subscribe for more stories that hit where it hurts, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if this happened in front of you? Halcyon Duval stepped into the soaring marble atrium of Mariton First Capital at exactly 3:41 p.m., the late summer light spilling through the massive windows like liquid gold. She walked with a posture honed by years of boardroom battles and quiet dismissals, her tailored slate gray suit neat and unassuming, chosen deliberately to draw neither pity nor spectacle. The only adornment was a single silver pin on her lapel and a modest watch worn under the cuff of her pressed sleeve. Her briefcase was leather, well used but meticulously kept. Her hair, tightly coiled and natural, was gathered into a bun so neat it looked sculpted. She moved with purpose, unhurried but confident, scanning the glossy lobby until her eyes landed on the reception desk ahead. The woman behind the counter was young, polished, with a glossy blonde bun and the stiff composure of someone who took her gatekeeping seriously. She was typing, quickly but absent-mindedly, glancing up at each new entrant with an expression bordering between weary professionalism and subtle judgment. When Halcyon stepped forward, the woman looked up, offered no greeting, and then immediately looked past her to the next man approaching, white, broad-shouldered, sporting a sharp blue suit and mirrored sunglasses. His presence lit her face into an accommodating smile. She raised a hand toward him, bypassing Halcyon entirely, and gestured him toward the executive desk with a breezy welcome. Halcyon remained where she was. She didn't raise her voice, didn't assert herself. She simply waited. After a beat, the receptionist turned back toward her, face already shifting back into something more neutral. Halcyon asked, evenly and clearly, to speak with Royce Haver regarding an institutional fund inquiry. The woman's lips pressed into a flat line. She glanced at her screen, tapped a few keys, then looked up. "There's no meeting under your name," she said coolly. Halcyon clarified that the appointment had been arranged through Royce's office directly, and that she'd flown in for it. The receptionist's eyes didn't mask the flicker of doubt or the subtle shift downward as she assessed Halcyon's appearance from bun to heels. With barely concealed reluctance, she pointed toward a row of chairs along the far wall near the vending machines and a janitor's cart. "You can wait over there," she said. Halcyon walked calmly to the seat. She didn't wince, but her hands, resting on her knees, were still. Over the next 20 minutes, Halcyon watched two other guests arrive. Both men, both white, both dressed like they just stepped out of a bespoke catalog, and both were ushered immediately through the frosted glass doors without a single question asked. One was offered espresso. The other was addressed by name before he said a word. Halcyon wasn't addressed at all. She sat there waiting, as the digital clock behind the reception desk ticked off long minutes in sterile silence. A few staff members passed by, eyes sliding over her like she was an anomaly, something out of place in the expensive stillness of the room. The woman at the desk occasionally looked over, but never long enough to acknowledge Halcyon's continued presence. Eventually, one of the junior analysts emerged, a young man barely old enough to order his own cocktails. He approached with a clipboard in hand and a tight, polite smile that failed to conceal his confusion. He asked if she needed help with setting up an account, perhaps for personal checking. Halcyon replied calmly that she was there on an institutional matter involving strategic fund realignment and had documentation to support it. He blinked, nodded, and excused himself. 10 minutes later, Royce Haver finally appeared. Tall, lean, face like chiseled marble and voice like cold brass. He approached with a look of barely disguised inconvenience. He greeted her with a handshake that lasted too short and a smile that vanished before it formed. No apology for the wait. No recognition of her name. Just a brisk nod and a curt gesture toward the nearest meeting room. Inside the glass-walled room, Royce didn't ask how she'd like her coffee. Didn't ask if she traveled far. He sat, opened a blank notepad, and asked what she was seeking from their services. Halcyon replied evenly, outlining a potential multi-hundred-million-dollar institutional transition. Royce stopped taking notes before she finished the sentence. She had barely taken her seat again when Royce emerged from the same hallway. He hadn't asked her to wait for any follow-up, yet here he was, walking slowly in her direction, not with concern or curiosity, but with a quiet smirk on his face like a man descending from a throne to deliver amusement to the court. He stood beside the reception desk, leaned in toward the young woman seated there, and muttered something with the cadence of a joke. Both laughed, short, tight, sharp laughs. Halcyon could hear one sentence drift above the rest. She probably thinks ETF stands for Extra Taco Funds. The receptionist laughed louder this time. Royce glanced back at Halcyon just once, the glance of someone who felt nothing but certainty that he could humiliate without consequence. Moments later, he approached her again, casual in stance but cold in purpose. His hands were in his pockets, his head slightly tilted as if speaking to someone whose hearing or intellect required condescension. He asked her in a tone sweetened with mock interest if she was sure she was in the right building. He noted there was a local credit union across the street that handled walk-in inquiries. Halcyon met his gaze, her face still. Her reply was measured and correct. She reiterated the nature of her portfolio, restated the intention of the meeting, and even referenced a recent acquisition their firm had publicized, subtly indicating her understanding of their operations. Royce's expression shifted slightly then, not to respect, but to annoyance. He gestured idly toward the hallway and said she might want to wait for someone from the onboarding team. He used the word onboarding like it was a toothbrush she'd forgotten how to use. She asked if that was necessary given the scale of her proposal, and he chuckled, not kindly. He said something about procedures, then something else about not wanting her to feel neglected. But it was clear. He wasn't interested in her business. He was interested in watching her leave. Minutes passed. The onboarding associate arrived. A young woman in a loose-fitting blazer, nervous and smiling too wide, sat across from Halcyon in a side room. The table between them was scratched laminate. The chairs squeaked. The woman flipped through the paperwork and squinted like the numbers might shift into a language she understood. When Halcyon explained the structure of the capital flow, overseas trusts, tax strategies, interlocking equity positions, the woman blinked, nodded, and asked if Halcyon had a simpler breakdown. She called it digestible. Halcyon paused, then slid a document across the table that summarized her asset routes into 3 tiers. The associate glanced at it, murmured something about it being pretty advanced for your first visit, and excused herself. Halcyon sat alone in the cold little room for 16 minutes before Royce entered again. He didn't sit this time. He stood by the door, arms folded, and said they had limited bandwidth this quarter and weren't looking for new capital partners outside of pre-approved lists. Halcyon asked if he was declining her on the basis of her capital or her presence. Royce's jaw tightened. He said something vague about alignment and brand fit. Then he added a final sting. He told her she might find better synergy with institutions designed to serve emerging communities. Halcyon didn't respond. She stood, placed her documents back in her bag, and turned to leave. Behind her, as she walked out of the room, she could hear Royce saying to the associate, "These people always come in with a stack of paper and a dream. Every time." The lobby was quieter, the foot traffic reduced, but the energy was no less hostile. A new receptionist sat behind the desk today, younger, darker-skinned, but still caught in the machinery of compliance. Halcyon gave her name, stated her business, and waited. This time she was directed directly to Royce's floor, though not with welcome. just silent acknowledgement. As she stepped off the elevator, Royce was already standing at the glass divider to his office, arms crossed, jaw set, a smile twitching across his lips. He waved her in. The space was curated with cold precision. Framed photos of golf courses, a shelf of books untouched, and a wall-mounted display cycling through stock tickers. Halcyon stood at the edge of the desk as Royce slowly lowered himself into his chair, motioning for her to sit with the detached courtesy of someone about to enjoy a show. He started with a compliment. Not a genuine one, but the kind designed to mock under the guise of praise. He said she had tenacity, that much was clear, and tenacity was a trait he found useful. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, fingers laced. Then he asked her to explain her strategy again, not for clarity, he said, but to make sure he wasn't overestimating her understanding. Halcyon began to speak. She was measured, articulate, precise. She outlined tiered equity mobility through private debt instruments and long-term reinvestment positions. Halfway through her explanation, Royce sat back and laughed. Not just a chuckle, but a real laugh, open and performative. He waved a hand and said, "Stop, stop. You sound like someone who read half a hedge fund blog and thought it was gospel." Halcyon's expression didn't flinch, but her spine straightened by a fraction. Royce didn't notice or didn't care. He pointed toward her and said, "Let me be honest. You talk a big game, but you don't carry the room. You walk in with documents like you expect to be taken seriously, but look at you. You dress like the budget version of competence." Then he looked at her hair, narrowed his eyes, and said, "And that's not how decision-makers show up. That's not boardroom. That's casual Friday in a nonprofit." Halcyon remained still, breathing through her nose. She didn't speak. Royce took that silence as permission. He stood and walked to the window, back turned, then spoke louder. He said there was a reason institutions like his had dress codes, expectations, standards, not just financial, but cultural. He said people like him had to protect the atmosphere of trust and elegance. He used that word, elegance. Then he turned around and added that perception matters more than intention. "You could be sitting on 10 million or 10 cents, he said, "but if the room feels off, I go with my gut." Then he smiled again. "And my gut says this, isn't it?" A staff member passed by the glass wall then, tapping lightly before entering with a folder. A woman in a smart black dress, clipboard in hand, eyes bouncing between Halcyon and Royce. She handed over the file and then, without warning, looked down at Halcyon's shoes and gave a smirk. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The message was loud in its silence. She exited with the same tight smile. Royce shook his head slightly and muttered something under his breath. Then louder, "You want to play in the big leagues, MS. Duval, dress the part, talk the part, live the part." He dropped her folder on the table, let it slide toward her without care, then added, "Or find somewhere that buys into fairy tales." Halcyon picked up the folder slowly. Her hand didn't shake. Her face didn't break. She nodded once and said thank you. Not because she was grateful, but because she needed no further confirmation. Her resolve was steel beneath skin now, the embarrassment of yesterday compressed into something dense and sharp behind her eyes. She dressed no differently. Her suit was the same cut, her shoes the same heel. Her natural hair remained pinned in the same sculpted coil. She made no concessions to the theater of their expectations. At reception, she was acknowledged, barely, and told to wait. 15 minutes passed before a junior analyst emerged from the side hallway, a man in his 20s wearing a jacket too large for his frame. He called her name, and without asking if she was ready, turned his back and walked, assuming she would follow. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask if she needed coffee or water. He led her not to the previous meeting room, but to a smaller space, windowless, with one dim fluorescent tube casting clinical light onto a scuff table. She sat. He opened a laptop, glanced at her, then began typing as if processing a form. He asked what she was there for today. She repeated slowly, the institutional investment discussion already documented and declined by Royce. He paused, blinked, then said he'd have to check. He left her in the room, the silence humming. 10 minutes passed before the door opened again. This time it was Royce. His appearance was identical: crisp suit, polished shoes, smirk affixed like armor. But his tone carried new layers. Less performative, more surgical. He sat across from her without greeting and said, "So you're back." She confirmed. He opened a folder and reviewed it, not for data, but for opportunities to dismiss. Then he looked at her directly and asked, "Why do you keep coming back here when it's clear this isn't your lane?" She held his gaze. He continued, now more relaxed, using his words like slow blades. "You're persistent, sure, but persistence isn't pedigree. Let me break this down plainly. We deal with a specific client profile, individuals who not only possess capital, but carry themselves with the refinement and polish required in our circles." His eyes drifted from her face to her shoulders, then down to her shoes. "Presentation matters, Ms. Duval. Not just your numbers." She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly. "We cultivate an aesthetic here. One that reflects heritage, legacy, influence. He paused, tilted his head, "you walk in here expecting access because you have assets. But access isn't just financial. It's cultural. It's visual. Frankly, your look doesn't say leadership. It says trying." He let that settle. Then he added, "I say this not to insult you, but to help you. Someone should," as if he were bestowing wisdom. Then he stood, called over the assistant analyst again, and said, "Run a soft background scan. Confirm there's no previous high-risk profile or off-record volatility." The analyst hesitated, confused. "She doesn't fit our standard portfolio filters," Royce clarified, loud enough for Halcyon to hear. "Unusual client type, unverified source behavior. Run the full flag set." Halcyon remained silent. She did not move. Royce turned to her once more and said, "Until we can confirm who exactly you are and what narrative you bring into this space, I recommend you refrain from presenting yourself as something you might not be ready for." Then he left. Later, while Halcyon sat alone in the room awaiting a response, another employee passed by. She didn't speak to Halcyon, but she paused, looked her over, and said to no one in particular, "Some people really underestimate how much appearances matter." Then she kept walking. A few minutes after that, the junior analyst returned. He apologized briefly and said they wouldn't be moving forward with any conversation until legal reviewed a few things. Halcyon stood, thanked him for the clarity, and exited the room without expression. As she walked past the reception area, Royce's voice drifted from a nearby corridor, laughing at something. She didn't pause to listen. She kept walking. The building remained the same, glass, marble, and curated silence. But something in the air had shifted. Her arrival was no longer a novelty. She had been categorized. The receptionist barely glanced up before picking up the phone and muttering a call code. Moments later, a sharply dressed floor manager arrived, not Royce this time, but another man wearing the same Mariton pin and the same look of practiced detachment. He asked Halcyon to wait in the lounge area, not the client room. He added that someone would be with her shortly, though his tone suggested otherwise. She walked to the designated space, settled into a seat near the glass wall, and waited. No one approached for 20 minutes. When she stood to inquire, the same manager intercepted her with a stiff smile and said, "Please remain seated. You're causing some disruption to the flow of our client floor." Halcyon raised a brow, but returned to her seat without protest. Across the room, 3 men in light gray suits, all white, glanced over and chuckled among themselves. One leaned toward another and muttered something that earned a laugh. Halcyon didn't turn her head. Minutes later, Royce appeared. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask why she was there. Instead, he walked past her to the reception counter, whispered something to the staff, then turned back and called for security. 2 guards in plain blazers arrived within seconds, their walk casual but unmistakably purposeful. Royce didn't look at Halcyon directly. He simply gestured toward her and said, "Escort her outside, please. This is not an active client engagement. She's affecting the client experience." Halcyon stood before the guards could say a word. Her voice was even. I'm seated quietly in a public client space, awaiting confirmation on a portfolio transfer initiated 2 weeks ago. Royce didn't answer. The guards paused, unsure. Royce added sharply, "You've been advised before. This is no longer appropriate. If she refuses to leave, we escalate." One of the guards nodded and stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough to invade space. Halcyon looked past him, directly at Royce, and said, "You're documenting this, correct? That you are removing a registered institutional entity from your premises without basis." Royce folded his arms and replied, "You're not registered with us. You're not recognized. You've been told that." Then he turned his back and walked away. The guards flanked her sides but did not touch her. She walked between them, calm, composed. As they passed through the lobby, a few clients turned to stare. A woman with pearl earrings whispered something to the man beside her, and they both smirked. As Halcyon neared the glass doors, one of the suited men from earlier called out loudly enough for the room to hear, "I guess someone thought this was the community bank." The others laughed. Halcyon didn't respond. The guards opened the door. She stepped outside into the sharp sunlight and stood still for a moment. The doors hissed shut behind her. No apology had been given. No incident had occurred. But her removal was complete. She didn't walk away immediately. She pulled out her phone, checked the time, and made a call. Her tone was clipped. "Begin full withdrawal process. Hold confirmations until I'm in transit. Delay notice to Mariton by 3 hours. I want the funds moved before they see it." Then she hung up, turned toward the avenue, and walked to her car. Inside Mariton, Royce returned to his office and sat behind his desk. He was not angry. He wasn't even particularly pleased. He was indifferent. His assistant entered with a printout, noted a client had called regarding a scheduled update on Royce's recommendation from last quarter. Royce said to delay the response until the afternoon. Then he picked up a silver pen, signed a form, and moved on. He never mentioned Halcyon again. Halcyon read it once, then again, then checked the timestamp and quietly exhaled through her nose. The call she had made on Friday, authorizing a full transfer of funds, had not even reached Meriton's notification team before they preemptively erased her from the appointment ledger. That morning, inside the bank's operation suite, Royce had summoned 2 compliance officers to his office. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain the events of the prior week. Instead, he handed over Halcyon's name and said, "Mark her as restricted. No forward contact, no further meetings, no client outreach. Classify under risk-based exclusion protocol." One of the officers looked up with faint hesitation and asked whether there was an incident code to log the action under. Royce didn't blink. Use C2, fit discrepancy and service alignment failure. That same afternoon, Halcyon's name was flagged internally as a mismatch for Meriton's profile tiering system. Her previous applications were removed from visibility. Her inquiries were hidden from dashboard filters. Any attempt to contact her through formal support channels would now return a generic error. Her account file was archived, not deleted, not closed, but sealed in a way that made it inaccessible to junior staff without VP-level override. Royce made sure of it. Outside Meriton's firewalls, Halcyon received silence. Her assistant attempted to reach the main line. No one answered. She tried a different channel. It was rerouted. Eventually, a call reached an unfamiliar associate who politely said the institution had streamlined client engagements this quarter and would not be accepting new evaluations until further notice. Halcyon said nothing to her team. She did not express outrage. She instructed them to focus on completion of external transfers and made no further mention of Mariton. But later that day, while reviewing archived emails, she found the initial confirmation message that had set the first appointment. The meeting had been manually approved by Royce himself. He had signed it with a note, looking forward to exploring value alignment. Now he had made sure she was classified as a threat to that very concept. Elsewhere inside the bank, Royce was reviewing weekly numbers with the regional performance director. They spoke about yield, about board relations, about the next candidate list for media exposure. There was no mention of Halcyon. But before the meeting ended, Royce turned to his assistant and said, "Scrub any ongoing correspondence. Remove calendar trails. I don't want our name associated with any of that." The assistant nodded. Files were deleted. Threads were archived. In less than 20 minutes, every trace of Halcyon's interaction with Mariton was wiped from operational history, as though she had never entered the building, never made a proposal, never existed inside the system. She had become a ghost in a place obsessed with visibility. 3 days later, a mid-tier analyst reviewing incoming fund movement flagged a large outbound request from an entity registered under a neutral partner custodian. The numbers were clean. The origin account traced back through complex holdings. The movement was legitimate, but the velocity raised eyebrows. The analyst escalated the notice up one level, where it landed on the desk of a senior strategist. The strategist recognized the pattern, traced the request chain, and realized it belonged to a group previously filtered by Royce's office. He hesitated, made a note, then reached for the phone to inform the VP. But before he dialed, he remembered a directive sent the week before: do not engage with legacy classified profiles. So he marked it observed, filed it, and moved on. Back in Halcyon's world, the transition was almost complete. Her instructions had been precise. The movement of her assets away from Mariton was executed without ceremony. No fanfare, no confrontation. She did not seek retribution, not yet. She simply removed her presence. She declined all inquiries from financial publications. She ignored invitations to speak on industry panels. She refused interviews from minor outlets, hoping to score a headline. Her silence became strategy. Her quiet exit a wound that no one at Mariton realized they had inflicted on themselves. She moved in stillness, but with power, rerouting liquidity like pulling breath from a drowning man without touching the water. When the call connected, her voice remained as calm as it had been during the worst of the previous week's humiliations, steady and sharpened by something colder than anger: calculation. She gave the instruction clearly, directly, and with no need to elaborate. Full liquidation. All positions tied to Mariton First Capital were to be terminated immediately. The funds were to be transferred within the next 45 minutes to pre-designated holding structures under Morgan & Price, with final custody moving to a private vehicle under her direct authority. There was no panic in her tone, no stress in her delivery, only surgical precision. The person on the other end of the line responded with an affirmation, no questions asked. They knew who she was, what authority she carried, and how little tolerance she had for delay. The call ended. The wheels began turning before she reached the sidewalk. Inside Mariton's internal network, a quiet alarm pinged the fund allocation system just 20 minutes later. A flagged entity, previously hidden under a nested registration, had triggered a withdrawal request not through the standard protocol, but through a high-priority, irrevocable transfer command initiated from outside brokerage partners. The number on the screen was staggering: $2.6 billion in total equity exposure, divided across institutional bonds, REITs, hedge positions, and foreign assets, all routed through conduits that now blinked red with exit signals. A junior fund controller noticed first, then called a floor manager. The manager checked the identifier, traced it to a neutral shell listed under a code that meant nothing to him. He elevated the flag to his superior, who, after reading the request details and cross-referencing custodial profiles, fell suddenly, disturbingly quiet. A third manager was called. By the time the alert reached Royce Haver's desk, it had already become a code red. Royce sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The name attached to the entity was not Halcyon Duval. It was a structure, Elan Capital Trust, but the contact email, once expanded, revealed a domain known in elite investment circles as belonging to one of the most aggressive private wealth architects in the country. His face drained. He clicked deeper, tracing portfolio assets, piecing together movement patterns. The magnitude of the withdrawal was not just financial, it was reputational. This wasn't just money leaving. It was power retracting itself. His eyes landed on the advisory note tied to the trust's founding board, and there, listed plainly, was her name: Halcyon Duval, Principal Architect and Managing Partner. Royce's mouth opened slightly. He stood, walked out of his office without a word, and headed straight for the executive suite. Elsewhere, executives were already receiving notifications. The compliance head's phone buzzed. The CFO stared at a frozen dashboard. One by one, senior leaders gathered, staring at the data with dawning horror. They had ejected her, laughed at her, erased her, and now, without raising her voice or threatening litigation, she had bled their institution of nearly $3 billion in asset alignment, without warning, without negotiation, without a single signature exchanged inside their walls. Down in the lobby, the receptionist, who had once refused to meet Halcyon's gaze, now answered a series of increasingly panicked calls asking for clarification on a high-profile client engagement. She didn't understand the urgency, but she obeyed, pulling up records, seeing only blank fields, empty logs, redacted entries. Then a final call came through, this time from a name she didn't recognize. The voice asked only one question: when was the last time Halcyon Duval entered the building? The receptionist stuttered. The caller hung up. Back at Royce's office, a meeting had already formed. Legal was there. Risk, public relations, internal controls. They were speaking over each other, trying to draft a plan, but it was too late. The fund had already cleared transfer confirmation. By the time they contacted Morgan & Price, the money had moved beyond reach. The custody logs sealed behind non-disclosure agreements that would never permit retroactive trace. Royce stared at the floor, one hand gripping the back of his chair, the other rubbing his temple as if pressure would reverse gravity. The system flagged keywords automatically: Phoenix, Trust, Eland Holdings, and cross-referenced their significance. The result was an emergency protocol code delivered directly to the inboxes of the board of directors. Most were flying, on calls, or in international time zones, but the magnitude of the alert triggered override access. Phone lines lit up. Video links snapped open. Within 37 minutes, a crisis session was underway, chaired by Meriton's global CEO from a private suite in Zurich. The expressions in the meeting were not confused. They were grim, because now the pieces had fallen into place. They had not simply lost a wealthy client. They had insulted, humiliated, and systematically rejected the founder and managing director of Phoenix Capital, a woman whose firm controlled strategic minority holdings in 4 global banks, and whose quarterly forecasts were cited by the Financial Board of Governors as trend-defining. Halcyon Duval was not just a name on a portfolio. She was the reason the portfolio existed. The revelation landed like an iron anvil in Royce Haver's chest. He was in his office reviewing a quarterly report when his secure line rang. He answered with his usual control, but within 20 seconds, his color changed. The voice on the other end was not from his department. It belonged to the global risk chair, who didn't ask questions. He gave orders. Royce was to appear immediately before the executive panel convened in the West Conference Hall. He was to bring every document, every interaction, every file tied to a client named Halcyon Duval or any affiliated holding. Royce began to speak. The voice cut him off. Do not talk. Move. By the time Royce arrived, the room was already full. The CFO, the CCO, 2 board members flown in by jet. Legal sat with laptops open, fingers still typing. A projection was on screen. An asset map with Phoenix Capital at the center, and a sprawling network of subsidiary tentacles radiating outward, many of which had passed through Meriton at some point in the last 6 years. Royce was motioned to the head of the table. The questions began. What was the nature of your engagement with this client? Why was she removed from the premises? Why were her records flagged for deletion? Why was her identity not verified through standard KYC checks? Royce attempted to explain the misunderstanding, citing incomplete information and internal misrouting. Legal shut him down. The CCO leaned forward and asked him directly, "Did you at any point authorize the classification of Ms. Duval as a service misfit?" Royce hesitated. The room waited. Finally, he said yes. The air shifted. The room became still. The CEO's voice broke the silence. You misjudged her. You misrepresented her. And you cost us one of the most strategically powerful capital entities in the Continental portfolio. You understand the implications of that, Mr. Haver? Royce nodded, though his throat burned. Outside the boardroom, the news was already bleeding through the upper floors. A confidential memo marked urgent, "Do not disclose," had been forwarded by accident to a communications coordinator, who had seen the name Halcyon Duval and gasped audibly. Within 20 minutes, the entire top level of Meriton staff knew that they had denied service to someone who could, in theory, devalue their brand with a single phone call. Whispers turned to questions. The tone among executives shifted from superiority to fear. One director asked aloud, "What else have we missed?" Another replied, "Who else have we turned away like this?" Back in the meeting, Royce sat motionless as the CEO delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative review. Pending final board evaluation, your employment status is suspended. Your access is revoked. You will not speak to press. You will not contact clients. And you will not set foot in any Mariton property until this matter is fully resolved. Do you understand? Royce said he did. A security officer was already waiting outside the door. He stood when Royce exited. No one said goodbye. As the sun lowered across the skyline, a black car waited outside the building. Halcyon wasn't in it. She didn't need to be. Her name was already everywhere. Not in protest, not in headlines, in silence, in contracts being pulled, in calls that stopped mid-sentence, in meetings postponed indefinitely. That evening, one of Meriton's legacy clients, a health fund with ties to Phoenix, canceled their quarterly review. No explanation given. The same night, an international advisory panel removed Mariton from its preferred provider shortlist. Still no press, no statement, just a shift in gravity. What started as rumors solidified into consensus when an internal email, carelessly forwarded by a compliance associate, was screenshotted and quietly passed to 3 hedge fund partners who had direct holdings linked to Meriton's emerging markets desk. By noon, sell orders were cascading across the floor. At exactly 1:14 p.m., an anchor on a financial news network broke the story in clipped tones. Mariton First Capital had lost a $2.6 billion asset partner after a senior executive misclassified and publicly dismissed the managing partner as a non-viable client. The anchor did not mention Halcyon's race, but social media did. By 3 p.m., the video compilations began. Anonymous accounts assembled timelines. Threads appeared, citing systemic exclusion, profiling, and institutional arrogance. A clip from an unrelated diversity summit 5 months earlier was resurfaced, where Meriton CEO had made comments about protecting traditional client archetypes. The context didn't matter anymore. The narrative was set. That evening, major clients went silent. The phones in the investor relations office rang less frequently, then not at all. By market close, Meriton's valuation had dropped 18.3%, wiping over $4 billion from its capitalization. Halcyon hadn't spoken a word in public, but her silence echoed louder than any press release could. The board moved swiftly. By nightfall, Royce Haver's name was removed from all public records, scrubbed from websites, and erased from press contacts. A formal separation statement was issued, citing violations of ethical conduct and breach of fiduciary representation. Behind the scenes, 2 additional executives were placed on suspension for related decisions in the handling of Halcyon's case. An anonymous whistleblower from inside the compliance department submitted a report indicating that the exclusion protocol used to target Halcyon had been previously flagged as a potential discrimination vector and ignored. The report leaked within hours. By the following morning, 3 U.S. senators issued public comments calling for a full audit of Meriton's KYC practices and internal compliance algorithms. One statement read, "We must ensure that institutions do not weaponize bias under the guise of protocol." Shareholders responded with fury. Emergency meetings were held. Lawsuits were threatened. A class action petition began circulating online, collecting names of clients who believed they had also been misclassified, misdirected, or ignored due to unspoken profiling systems. A group of former employees stepped forward, offering to testify about the culture inside Maritan, how it valued image above merit, compliance above conscience, optics above truth. Internal morale plummeted. Half a dozen key employees in the private wealth division tendered resignations within 48 hours, citing reputational toxicity and moral conflict. Recruiters from rival banks hovered like vultures, swooping in to poach remaining talent with promises of integrity and progress. The pressure forced Maritan's hand. They called a press conference. It was held in the same atrium where Halcyon had once stood ignored, overlooked, and dismissed. Now, the space was filled with journalists, cameras, and hushed tension. The CEO stepped to the podium, visibly thinner, voice measured but brittle. He acknowledged a failure in judgment. He admitted that institutional blind spots had led to the mishandling of a client whose contributions to the financial industry were undeniable. He said the company would be conducting a comprehensive review of its practices. He said they were committed to change. He did not say Halcyon's name. Outside, protesters began to gather. Some held signs. Others wore plain suits and carried briefcases, standing silently in a symbolic reversal of exclusion. One woman stood alone, wearing a navy blazer, hair in a coil, holding a placard that read, "We belong where value is." The image went viral before the conference ended. Meanwhile, Halcyon remained silent. Her publicist declined interview requests. Her office issued no statement. She continued with her work, expanding capital flow into sustainable microlending platforms and onboarding 2 emerging asset groups previously denied access by Maritan. She did not engage in revenge. She focused on redirection. Her staff said she was calm, focused, unwavering. One insider shared a quote she had murmured during a private meeting. "You don't fight fire with fire. You fight it by building the kind of world it can't burn." The quote appeared on a blog, then was picked up by Forbes, then printed on the cover of a leadership magazine beneath her profile. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Maritan's standing and the seismic fallout that shook its upper ranks, a strange quiet settled over its former power centers. The media frenzy had cooled, legal proceedings had shifted behind closed doors, and the public had moved on to the next scandal, the next downfall, the next outrage. But some names lingered. Royce Haver had vanished from the industry overnight, but the ripples of his actions still moved beneath the surface. And yet, amid those ripples, something unexpected began to emerge. Not just silence, not just resignation, but reckoning. He had disappeared from financial media, from boards, from panels, but not from his own memory. And in that solitude, away from titles and control, Royce began to confront what he had become. His arrogance had been armor. His dismissal had been easy. But now, stripped of the illusion of invulnerability, he found himself reliving every word he had said to Halcyon Duval, every smirk, every glance, every insult clothed as policy. He watched the clip of her quiet exit from a bank again and again, noticing not the indignity he had imposed, but the dignity she had preserved. For the first time in years, he didn't see her as an interruption. He saw her as a mirror. It was 3 months later when an email arrived in the inbox of Halcyon's foundation office. It was unsigned at first, then resent with the name, Royce Haver. The message was short. It acknowledged damage. It named guilt. It asked for a meeting, not to redeem, not to defend, but to understand. Halcyon didn't respond immediately. She read the email once, then again days later. She remembered his face. She remembered the silence in the lobby, the forced laughter, the words he had thrown like stones wrapped in policy. She had no obligation to respond, but something in her paused. She was not interested in vengeance. She was interested in change. A week later, Royce sat across from her in a modest office downtown, not a boardroom, not a glass tower, just a simple space filled with books, plans, and warmth. He wore no suit. He spoke without performance. He did not explain his actions. He detailed his awakening. He confessed to ignorance, to fear disguised as superiority, to decades of being shaped by systems that had always told him he was the standard. And then, in a voice stripped of the shielded confidence he had once weaponized, he asked to be useful. Halcyon listened, measured, and then made a decision. She invited him, not as a partner, not as a public gesture, but as an entry-level consultant in one of her newer initiatives, a program designed to train financial officers in historically marginalized communities on institutional navigation, funding strategies, and bias recognition. He would start from the bottom. He would shadow. He would listen. She did not promise forgiveness. She offered the opportunity to earn humility. Royce accepted. Quietly, diligently, he showed up each day. He took notes. He sat in the back of workshops. He followed junior associates to community sessions. He never introduced himself by title. He was no longer the man who walked into rooms expecting deference. He was learning, not leading. And in that process, he began to see a different kind of value, not just capital, not just structure, but people. At first, participants were wary. Some recognized him. Others whispered. But Halcyon made no announcement. She let time and action speak. Slowly, Royce became a presence, not a warning. One afternoon, a young entrepreneur approached him after a workshop and asked how someone like him had ended up in a room like this. Royce paused, then replied, by earning the right to enter it the right way. The moment went unnoticed by others, but it marked a quiet turning point. He was not seeking applause. He was earning perspective. Meanwhile, Halcyon's program expanded. It grew beyond cities, beyond states. She launched a partnership with several financial institutions who had seen the fallout from Mariton and realized that performative policies were no longer enough. Her program became mandatory in some banks, recommended in others, but transformative in all. It wasn't just training. It was re-education, not to punish, but to rewire. Her name no longer needed to carry vengeance. It carried vision. Years later, Royce was asked to speak, briefly, at a panel on equity in finance. He didn't want to. Halcyon encouraged him to say only what he knew. He stood, looked out at the crowd, and told them, "I am not here to give answers. I am here because someone gave me the space to finally ask the right questions." It wasn't a speech. It was an admission. In the quiet after the panel, Halcyon and Royce stood side by side near the exit. She looked at him once, and he nodded, not in triumph, but in gratitude. Not for redemption, but for being allowed to rebuild differently. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it the turning point, the downfall, or the unexpected redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here.